Welcome to week 2 of WORK1004, so week 2 of the Foundations of Management. Today we're going into the historical context of management, so how management dot has evolved across time and how forms of management has changed from a more systematic to a more sort of fluid, sort of different tailored sort of types of management. So let's just get right into it. Let's just turn the camera off and let's look at the module slide. All right, so today, most okay, every for work 1004, the majority of information is conveyed through the textbook. So the mandatory reading is actually quite important. We talked about the mandatory reading last time. So it is this textbook right here. If you would load, yes. So it is this textbook right here. We were supposed to read chapter 2, which is quite a hefty chapter, but all of the information that we discussed, whether it is information in the tutorials, whether it is information in the lectures, the recorded lectures, or the tutorials, all of it all comes from information in the reading. So if we read a reading and you understand the reading, then you basically master all of the information in week 2 for Foundations of Management. So let's get into it. So in week 2, we really talked about the historical context from traditional to modern sort of styles of management. So there was a shift between managers between focusing on the production to focusing on the humanity of production. So instead of only focusing on the objective outputs, on the outputs and how good the business is performing, managers nowadays are also concerned with a variety of metrics, not just the productivity of the humans, but also the well-being of the workers that work for the organization. So we talked about the classical perspective. Now within the classical perspective, there are a few different branches of the classical perspective and how management thinking has evolved from the classical perspective to nowadays. So in the classical perspective, we have 3 types of different styles or different organizations of management. We have scientific management, we have bureaucracy or bureaucratic management, and then we also have the administrative perspective to management. Let's just get into it. So the idea of scientific management is a subfield of classical management, and it's the perspective that emphasized scientifically determined changes in management practices, as shown as improving labor productivity. So instead of thinking of management as more of a human element, they approach scientific management approaches management to more of a systematized, of a more standardized, and a rigid form of management. So the general approaches to the idea and the philosophies of scientific management is that managers should develop a standardized method to doing each job. So each person performs a job with a very specific task and a very specific role. So by everyone doing everyone's job perfectly, the entire organization could work well. So you could think of this as the factory lines. This perhaps comes into play during the Industrial Revolution. Think of Ford, right? How Ford pioneered the assembly line. Each person has a very specific, a very standardized job, and that he or she, the person that is conducting the job, should just do the job to the best of their abilities, and that is the role of the manager to conduct and to create jobs that are very, very standardized. Some other general approaches is supported workers by planning their work and eliminating interruptions. So under scientific management, they see employees as cogs in an organization that performs a very simple job. And the role of managers right here is to ensure that the organization works well by giving workers the job, telling them exactly what they should do, and eliminating any interruptions or any anomalies that should arise. So this is the classical perspective. This is one of the classical perspectives. Another idea of scientific management is that wage increases will incentivize workers to increase their output. So this is a very like input-output sort of situation. And examples of this will be for this production, the production line, and specialized tasks. Now, there is certainly a place and a time for scientific management, and even today, certain manufacturing jobs should definitely improve ideas of scientific management. Contributions of this philosophy, of this approach to management, includes um, emphasizing the importance of compensation for performance, right? Um, People that worked in the Ford production lines are really well paid middle class workers. It also demonstrated the importance of personal selection and training. Some criticisms to this philosophy, to this thinking an approach to management, is that it does not appreciate the social context of work and the higher needs of work. The views of scientific management to workers is that they are there to fulfill a specific job, a job that is laid out and with no additional interruptions. They just do the job, get it done, and then that is the purpose of the worker. So it doesn't appreciate higher needs of the workers. It doesn't appreciate that perhaps workers could offer additional value to the company besides just the repetitive work of the standardized tasks. Another criticism is that it does not acknowledge the variance in individuals, whereas perhaps more modern views of management will see individuals more based on their individual strengths and weaknesses and allocate jobs accordingly. The scientific management really just sees people as as semi capital or semi machinery that could fulfill certain roles and certain obligations. In similar line to that, it also scientific management or the views and philosophies of scientific management also tend to regard workers as uniform and ignore individual ideas and differences related to that. Okay. So this is the first perspective within the classical perspective of management. It is the idea of scientific management, and it really is a reflection of its time, thinking of the Industrial Revolution, thinking of workers moving from the countryside into the city and performing jobs that are very standardized, that are very that does not really provoke the need to think a lot, just doing the job. Another form of the classical perspective on management is bureaucracy. So bureaucracy is a subfield of classical management where it looks at the organization as a hierarchy, as a hierarchical structure, where it focuses on rational authority and formal structure. So those are the two keys. A focus on rational authority and formal structure, where advancement is based on merit instead of connections. Rules and rules are written and records are emphasized. So if we think of like governments nowadays, the governments are the perfect examples of bureaucracy. It is almost synonymous. The word bureaucracy is almost synonymous with government, where each person knows their role, and the structure of the organization is based on it is certainly based on a formal structure and a rational authority. So the manager above the worker has authority over the worker, the middle manager has authority over the managers, and the high level managers has authority over the middle managers. So this bureaucratic structure to management certainly makes organizations organizations and structures organizations more structured and more organized, and it emphasizes the hierarchical nature of certain jobs during that time. Now, even to this day, many companies are very bureaucratic and more top down than it is bottom up, and there is certainly merit to this view of organization and to this view of management. To have management increase in their position, not based on their connections, not based on who they know, who refers them, but more based on merit. So this is also the idea of a meritocracy, which I think should be the strive of most companies. Okay. However, there are also criticisms to bureaucracies. First and foremost, these are not efficient. These are not as pure and as efficient as Max Weber perhaps theorized, because inefficiency in large organizations will certainly perhaps arise. And another problem to this is, in bureaucracy, each person's role is very, very predetermined. Each person's role is very predefined. So instead of thinking of the end goal or the ultimate goal of the organization or the company, people get bogged down and only think about their own individual roles and achieving their own individual roles and jobs within the bureaucracy. So this may cause the means to become the end and the goals of these workers, and can degenerate into a situation whereby the means become the goals themselves, where ticking boxes within the bureaucracy instead of finishing goals is emphasized. So where ticking boxes is emphasized over finishing actual goals and objectives of the organization. Lastly, the idea of bureaucracy is that people are all rational. People are all perfect cogs within the machine. However, in reality, people are very irrational. People misbehave. People lash out. People do not do their work on time. So bureaucracy may be the perfect organization in theory, where everyone has a certain role and they achieve the role, and this perfect structure of rational authority and formal structure exists. However, in reality, the practices do not actually align with the ideal of a perfect bureaucratic organization. So here is the ideal bureaucracy and some features of it, and how perhaps why it may not be the case. Okay. Administrative principles is once again the third subfield in the classical management view of historical views on management that focuses on the total organization rather than on the individual workers. So if we think of the classical views of management, this is a reoccurring theme. So delining management functions of planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. So these are examples of business bureaucracies. Okay, so within administrative principles, the functions of management are laid out as organizing and forecasting, planning and forecasting, organizing, commanding and directing, coordinating, which includes leading and controlling. So if we think of the principles from administrative principles, which are from the classical views of management, these principles of management certainly lines up with what we talked about last week about the process of management that we talk about nowadays. So although these are historical views although administrative, bureaucratic, and scientific management are all views of more of a historical past, they are certainly still influencing management thought and management literature to this day. Okay, so moving a little bit away from classical management, we want to talk about how management has evolved in the past 200 years into what it is today, where we have a greater emphasis on the humanistic perspective. So the humanistic perspective is the management perspective that emphasizes the importance of understanding human behaviors, needs, and attitudes of the workplace. So instead of just emphasizing the role, the job of the person, and the output of the person, we emphasize human behavior, the needs of the workers, and the attitudes of the workplace. Because this is the idea that when workers are well treated, they have a greater output. The human relations movement, or the human resources perspective, and behavioral science approaches are three branches under the humanistic perspective. And we also talked about the example of the Harford studies. You could certainly look into the Harford studies. It's quite an interesting study that backs up the idea of a humanistic perspective and paying special emphasis on people. Along with the development of a more worker-centric view of management instead of a product or organization-centered view of management, behavioral science also increased in its literature and also adds to the idea of management and how managers should actually approach problems and opportunities that arise from management. So management science perspective uses math, uses statistics, and other quantitative techniques to analyze managerial problems. So this is also a very sort of rational sort of approach to management. More recent approaches, such as systems thinking, contingency view, and total quality management, are also subsections of the management science perspective. So improving efficiencies through analyzing the past through statistical and quantitative techniques. System technique is expansion of humanistic perspective. Synergies is the idea that whereas scientific management will state that every individual just does everyone's role, and that would be the maximum output for organizations. Synergies refer to when organizations as a whole are greater than the sum of its parts. So, for example, if when the marketing department works with the sales department, the resulting outcome will be far greater than if the marketing department and the sales department worked independently of each other. So this is an evolution of the thoughts on management, whereas previously management may just think, oh, the marketing department should just fulfill the jobs and fulfill the roles of marketing, and the sales department should just fulfill the jobs and fulfill the roles of the sales department. However, more recently, management realized that synergies between departments and synergies between perhaps branches or even departments of a company actually creates greater value for the organization than just the sum of the individual parts. We also have the contingency view, which is an extension of the humanistic perspective of management, where the success of the organization is contingent or dependent on the management's identification of key variables. So this is the idea that every situation is unique, or perhaps every situation differs in some sort of way. Whereas the universalist view of perhaps a classical sort of management approach would be there is one best way. Well, people will say, the best way to manufacture a car is the best way to manufacture doorknobs is to do this, this, and this. Whereas the contingency view of more of a contemporary view on management would be, every situation is unique. Now, certainly, this also depends on what sort of industry this manager is operating in, but there is certainly merit to the contingency view, where the results and the perspective of a company is dependent on the situation and dependent on on um, on 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 various factors, rather than there is just one universal and one best way to do a certain task. Okay. Human resources perspective once again combines perception of job design and theories to motivate and use the full use to the worker's potential. So whereas perhaps scientific and bureaucratic or administrative perspectives on management will say that workers should just do their job to this extent and then we are happy, human resources perspective want to maximize the potential of these workers rather than just have them accomplish a certain goal. Supply chain management, things like that, total quality management, and whatnot. So here's a chapter summary, which is a screenshot of this ebook, which is the textbook that we're supposed to read, and I think this really summarizes most of the main points that we are to look at. So yeah, I mean. I pretty much summed up most of the main points about the views on management and how it varies from time to time, from the traditional sort of classical views to nowadays with a more humanistic emphasis on the human resource perspective, where workers should not just be doing their job, but the company and the manager should actually encourage workers to reach their full potential. To reach their full potential through encouraging them and whatnot. So yeah, I have summed up the most of the main points and most of the takeaways from week 2 of WORK1004. I do hope this video was helpful or informative or entertaining in some way or the other. So yeah, I hope to see you guys next time, and without further ado, take care and goodbye.